Hollywood's golden age was a dream factory, glittering stars, red carpets, and stories that lived forever. But behind those perfect smiles and flashing lights were men quietly unraveling. While millions adored them on screen, many were suffering in silence, trapped behind the curtain of fame. Some of the most beloved actors of the era carried secret burdens so heavy, they saw only one way out. In this video, we're uncovering the haunting final chapters of legendary men who seemed to have it all, until everything came crashing down. Their names lit up marquees, but their endings remain heartbreaking. George Reeves. To millions of fans, George Reeves was the perfect embodiment of strength and justice. As the star of Adventures of Superman in the 1950s, he soared across television screens as the Man of Steel, a symbol of hope for children and families across America. But off-screen, George was anything but invincible. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, Reeves found himself typecast, struggling to land serious roles, and quietly sinking into frustration. Hollywood had used him, praised him, and then left him behind. And as the spotlight faded, so did his sense of purpose. He tried to revive his career through other projects, but the industry that once adored him now treated him like a joke. Superman stuck in a phone booth he couldn't escape. Then came the night of June 16, 1959. George was found dead in his bedroom from a single gunshot wound to the head. The official ruling? Suicide. But almost immediately, rumors of foul play exploded. Witnesses at the scene gave conflicting accounts. Some claimed they heard multiple gunshots. Others pointed fingers at his fiancée, or even at her powerful ex-lover, who had deep connections in Hollywood and politics. Theories of murder cover-ups still circulate to this day. Was it really self-inflicted? Or did George stumble into something darker, something he was never meant to survive? Despite the unanswered questions, what's painfully clear is that the man who brought Superman to life felt powerless in his final moments. His death was a gut punch to fans, and a chilling reminder that even the strongest heroes can break when the cameras stop rolling. But George wasn't the only one hiding his pain behind a smile. Another rising star, young, charming, and full of promise, would fall just as hard and just as fast. Scotty Beckett. Before Macaulay Culkin or Shirley Temple, there was Scotty Beckett, the golden boy of 1930s Hollywood. With his signature dimples and innocent grin, Scotty became a household name as part of our gang, also known as the Little Rascals. He was the adorable sidekick, the scene stealer, the kid everyone wanted to hug. But behind the camera, the pressures of fame came crashing down before he even had the chance to grow up. By the time he hit his teens, Scotty was already a star, and already spiraling. The industry had no safety net for child actors back then. There were no therapists, no guidance, no real protections. And Scotty? He was tossed into the deep end. Fame had come too fast, and life outside the studio lot didn't feel real anymore. As he got older, his career stalled, and the demons crept in. Alcohol, pills, arrests. The kind of headlines that once made him famous now followed him for all the wrong reasons. He bounced between small TV roles and failed comebacks, each one more heartbreaking than the last. By 1968, at just 38 years old, Scotty Beckett checked into a Los Angeles nursing home, not for rest, but for medical attention after suffering a brutal beating. Days later, he was dead. The official cause? An overdose of barbiturates. But whether it was intentional, accidental, or something far worse has never been truly resolved. What is certain, though, is that the child who once lit up the screen had been all but forgotten by the time his light finally faded. And sadly, Scotty's story wasn't unique. Hollywood's spotlight may be bright, but its shadows run deep. Just ask the voice behind some of your favorite childhood cartoons, a man whose end was just as tragic and just as silent. Frank Graham. You may not recognize his face, but if you grew up with Saturday morning cartoons, you've heard his voice. Frank Graham was one of the most prolific voice actors of his time, lending life to characters in Warner Brothers, MGM, and Tex Avery animations. He was the wolf in Red Hot Riding Hood, the charming narrator in radio dramas, and the invisible thread stitching together some of the most beloved shows of the 1940s. But Frank Graham lived in the background. He wasn't chased by paparazzi or plastered on billboards. He was the man behind the mic, working constantly, but rarely seen. And in an industry that worshipped the spotlight, being invisible often came at a heavy cost. On the outside, Graham had what many dreamed of: a steady career, respected colleagues, and a growing portfolio of work. But privately, he battled depression and mounting personal stress. The demands of the radio world, always performing, always perfect, wore him down in ways few understood. In a time when mental health was whispered about, not treated, Frank had nowhere to turn. On September 2, 1950, at just 35 years old, Frank Graham died by suicide through carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage. The news barely made headlines. There were no tributes, no retrospectives, just a quiet exit for a man who had given so many their voice. It was a devastating reminder. Even those who bring joy to millions can feel utterly alone. Graham's death left a void in the industry, but even worse, it left a warning that went largely ignored. And while Frank suffered in silence, the next man on our list made headlines for all the wrong reasons. A shocking murder-suicide that turned one of Hollywood's brightest stars into the center of a real-life nightmare. Gig Young. Gig Young wasn't just another handsome face in old Hollywood. He was the real deal. Suave, charming, and endlessly talented, he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in 1970 for his haunting role in They Shoot Horses, Don't They? It was a career-defining performance, and for a brief moment, it looked like Gig had finally reached the peak. But the reality was far darker than anyone imagined. Behind the camera, Young was unraveling. His life was a storm of broken relationships, alcoholism, and mental health struggles. He'd been married multiple times, including a short-lived union with Elizabeth Montgomery from Bewitched, which ended abruptly and bitterly. Directors and producers began to avoid working with him, fearing his instability. Then, in 1978, just weeks after marrying his fifth wife, Kim Schmidt, a young, aspiring actress, Gig Young did something no one saw coming. On October 19th, in their New York apartment, he shot Kim and then turned the gun on himself. They were found lying side by side. The industry was stunned. How could an Oscar winner, someone who had seemingly clawed his way back to the top, commit such a horrific act? Some blamed his ongoing mental health issues. Others pointed to the pressure of fading fame or his lifelong battle with addiction. But no explanation ever made the headlines feel any less surreal. The murder-suicide shook Hollywood to its core. It wasn't just the loss of a gifted actor, it was the brutal reminder that success offers no immunity from darkness. Fame doesn't heal, and talent doesn't save. And for all of Gig's accolades, his story ended not with applause, but with silence. A silence that would echo through the halls of Hollywood, right into the final days of another star who spent his career wearing a smile while hiding a secret pain. Paul Hurst. Paul Hurst was the kind of actor who didn't need to be flashy, he just needed the screen. With a rugged face and gravelly voice, he became a staple of westerns, war films, and gritty dramas throughout the 1930s and 40s. You've seen him, even if you didn't know his name, whether as the Union deserter in Gone with the Wind or in countless dusty shootouts alongside legends like John Wayne. He wasn't the star. He was the one who made stars look good. Hurst worked constantly, appearing in over 300 films. But behind the scenes, the endless grind of Hollywood took its toll. By the early 1950s, the roles started to dry up, and even when he was on set, his health was quickly deteriorating. Then came the devastating news: terminal cancer. The disease progressed rapidly, leaving him in chronic pain and increasingly unable to work, and for a man who had always been tough, always in control, that was unbearable. On February 27, 1953, Paul Hurst made a decision. At the age of 64, he took his own life at his home in Hollywood. There was no dramatic scandal, no mystery, no theories, Just a straightforward, heartbreaking exit by a man who saw no way to endure what was coming next. Friends and co-stars were devastated, but many understood. The quiet dignity with which Paul carried himself in life was reflected in the final choice he made, one born of pain, not weakness. He'd spent his entire life playing resilient men on screen. It was only fitting, in his mind, that he faced death the same way, on his terms. And while his story ended quietly, the next one did anything but. It belonged to a young man once hailed as the future of Hollywood, a charismatic star whose rise was as swift as his fall. And when he broke, he left behind a single note, and a stunned, heartbroken family. Ross Alexander. In the 1930s, Ross Alexander was the kind of leading man Hollywood adored. Tall, polished, and effortlessly charming. With stage roots in New York and a golden ticket contract from Warner Brothers, he seemed destined for superstardom. Critics praised his performances in films like A Midsummer Night's Dream and Captain Blood, and studios saw him as the next big thing. But behind those elegant suits and boyish charm was a man quietly unraveling. Ross was barely 30 when his life began to spiral. His first wife, actress Aletta Friel, tragically died by suicide in 1935, a blow from which he never fully recovered. Though he tried to move on, the loss weighed heavily on him, and whispers about his private life followed him from studio lot to studio lot. In an industry obsessed with image, Ross carried burdens he couldn't speak about, and Hollywood wasn't interested in giving him space to heal. As his career stalled, the pressure mounted. Studios that once rolled out the red carpet began backing away. His roles grew smaller, his opportunities fewer. And Ross, once the talk of Tinseltown, became another name on the long list of almosts and what could have beens. On January 2, 1937, at just 29 years old, Ross Alexander took his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot. The same way his wife had, as if her tragedy had etched itself permanently into his fate. A suicide note was never found, only questions and grief. Hollywood moved on quickly. The studio reused his final scene for another actor. His name faded, but the sadness lingered. Ross's death was one of the earliest and most jarring reminders that stardom can't cure heartbreak. He had the looks, the talent, and the spotlight, but not the peace he so desperately needed. And while Ross's story ended abruptly, another actor, much older and seemingly stronger, would make a decision of his own decades later. One that was quiet, devastating, and deeply human. Richard Farnsworth. Richard Farnsworth was never your typical Hollywood star. He didn't chase fame, it found him. Starting as a humble stuntman in the 1930s, he quietly worked behind the scenes for decades, performing dangerous feats in classics like The Ten Commandments and Spartacus. He didn't speak much, didn't brag, and rarely sought the spotlight. But when he finally stepped in front of the camera in the 1970s, something clicked. Audiences didn't just see an actor, they saw a man who felt real. With a weathered face and steady voice, Farnsworth became a late-blooming star. His performance in The Straight Story, a quiet, powerful film by David Lynch, earned him an Academy Award nomination at age 79, making him one of the oldest nominees in Oscar history. It was a triumph decades in the making. But behind his calm eyes, something far darker was building. Farnsworth had been privately battling terminal cancer. The pain was intense, and the prognosis was grim. Known for his toughness and quiet dignity, he rarely spoke about it. He kept working, smiling, and doing interviews as if nothing were wrong. But the disease was progressing quickly, and it was relentless. On October 6, 2000, at his ranch in New Mexico, Richard Farnsworth ended his life with a self-inflicted gunshot. He was 80 years old. There was no scandal, no cryptic note, no messy speculation. Just a man who had lived a long, honest life, and who decided to leave it before the pain could erase the dignity he'd spent a lifetime building. His death struck a chord throughout the industry. It wasn't about fame or failure. It was about control, a final decision made by a man who had always moved quietly through a loud industry. But long before Richard ever stood in front of a camera, one man had already etched his name into history, as both a trailblazer and Hollywood's first suicide. Charles Avery. Long before talkies, Technicolor, and the rise of Hollywood royalty, there was Charles Avery, one of the earliest architects of American cinema. Born in 1873, Avery became a central figure during the silent film era, working closely with Keystone Studios, the very birthplace of slapstick comedy. He directed and acted in over 150 films, helping shape the language of visual storytelling at a time when the industry was still inventing itself. Avery wasn't just part of Hollywood history, he helped create it. He worked alongside legends like Mack Sennett and Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle, and he brought chaotic, fast-paced comedy to the screen long before Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton became household names. Behind the scenes, he was considered sharp, creative, and fiercely dedicated to his craft. But as the industry evolved and silent films gave way to sound, many pioneers were left behind, and Charles Avery was no exception. The golden age he helped build no longer had room for men like him. Studios shifted focus to younger, flashier stars. Directors who once commanded entire studios were now collecting dust in forgotten offices. In 1926, at the age of 52, Charles Avery died by suicide. Few details were released, and even fewer people talked about it. Some early reports tried to spin it as natural causes, but later evidence pointed clearly to a self-inflicted end. His passing barely made the papers, a tragic irony for a man who helped put Hollywood on the map. Avery's death is now considered by many historians to be the first known suicide within the Hollywood film industry. A grim milestone in a town that would see many more follow. He was a trailblazer, an innovator, and a victim of an industry that quickly forgets those who laid its foundations. His name may be missing from the Walk of Fame, but his fingerprints are all over its history. And now, decades later, his story, and the stories of so many others like him, deserve to be remembered. Because sometimes, the biggest tragedies are the ones we were never told. They were cowboys, superheroes, child stars, and silver screen legends. But beneath the glitz, behind the scripts, they were just men. Men battling pain that fame couldn't fix and silence that applause couldn't fill. For some, it was illness. For others, heartbreak, addiction, or the crushing weight of expectations. And for many, the one thing they couldn't find was peace. Hollywood rarely slows down to grieve its own. The spotlight moves fast. One premiere fades into the next, and names that once lit up marquees become footnotes in old tabloids or trivia nights. But these men weren't just tragic endings. They were human stories, full of talent, struggle, and a quiet desperation that should never have been ignored. Their lives mattered far more than their final moments. And remembering them, not just as headlines or Hollywood casualties, but as people, might be the most important tribute of all. Because in a town built on illusion, sometimes the darkest truths are the ones hiding behind the brightest lights.